to today's talk. We'll be talking through Beyond Boundaries, quality testing at speed and scale, and how Queensland University of Technology was able to accomplish transformative change by utilizing test automation and DevOps. So get into some brief introductions here. My name is Michael Dailey. I'm the Director of Technical Product Marketing here at Provar, and I'm joined by Mr. James Rail. Want to introduce yourself?
Good morning, everyone. I'm James Rail, the Program Director at the Queensland University of Technology. We hope you've got some popcorn, sitting back and relaxing and about to enjoy our show.
Yeah, absolutely. So sit back, relax, try not to fall asleep in those recliners. Stay with us here. We promise to keep it as short as we can. So before we get things kicked off from the QUT side of things, I want to give a brief kind of introduction into who we are as a company. So for those of you that aren't aware of Provar, we've been around for about 10 years now, and we've kind of found our niche in the Salesforce testing space. So Salesforce test automation has really been around for a long time, but a lot of times people are utilizing generic tooling and other things that aren't as purpose-built for some of the niche kind of things that you find in Salesforce, like Lightning Web Components and custom complex technologies. So we have offices globally in the US, UK, Australia, and in India as well. And we've got about 250 or more customers worldwide, so utilizing test automation. So that's who we are. So I'll get into kind of the introductory topic here, and really this is the most common conversation that we tend to have with our prospects and customers is we're looking at manual testing, we're looking at automated testing, kind of what's the benefit, what can we expect in terms of value if we want to switch from one to the other. So we'll begin our discussion here by looking at this graph here. And this graph takes a couple assumptions in mind. So we're assuming that we're running about 200 tests across 3 different environments, so pretty standard, and shooting for about 80% regression coverage. For those of you wanting 100% test automation coverage, it's a pipe dream. It's probably not going to happen, but 80% is a good number, right? So all those things kind of in mind, of course, we have our 3 Salesforce annual releases. If we're looking at this graphic here, we have about, starting on the left-hand side, if we're starting from 1 release a month, which is pretty standard for a lot that may be doing like a 4-week sprint cycle, you're looking at about 1,000 hours in terms of manual testing hours saved with all these things being equal if you're utilizing automation for those testing cases as well. If you kind of move to the right there, of course, 2, there's a slight increase. And then as you get to releasing about daily or 20 times a month, we notice a significant scaling increase in ROI if you're coming from a manual testing background and adopting test automation. So not just the actual manual testing hours, but also maintenance as well. Maintenance on test cases is something that we hear a lot about, both on the manual testing side, but also on the test automation side. So if you're utilizing something like Selenium, you end up spending a lot of your time updating your test cases every time Salesforce does a release, or every time your developers or your admins make changes. So these are things to kind of keep in mind if you're looking to adopt test automation. So shifting left is a common topic that we hear a lot in the testing space and the DevOps space as well. And really what this means is testing earlier and testing more often. But in order to accomplish this, it tends to be more of a burden on the teams because that usually just means that you're spending more hours, more resources testing, which is not always the best way to tackle a problem. If you're looking at this graphic here, really what this is illustrating is the exponential increase in the cost of finding and resolving bugs as you move through the software development lifecycle. So on the left-hand side, in your initial phases, if you're finding those bugs early on, then of course it's going to cost significantly less for your team to resolve and fix those bugs if you were finding them in like the early developer sandbox stages. And as we move to the right, of course, we're looking at an exponential increase, somewhere around 50x there. So really we need to be asking, what's the primary goal of our testing strategy? What are we trying to accomplish through testing? So it's not just finding bugs, that's one aspect of it, but it's also kind of improving the overall quality of your applications. So be thinking about those things. And this graph here, of course, it's exponentially increasing just like the previous one. But of course, shifting left, it does come with this certain drawbacks if you're doing everything manually. Because really what we're looking at here is this realistic challenge of testing more often. And as you well know, you can't just throw more resources at a problem and fix it. That's not necessarily scalable. So we're talking about automation at speed and scale here. So manual testing, more often is definitely a best practice, but it can be time consuming. And it even causes us sometimes to slow down our release process If we just want to add more time in the cycle for testing, well, then that's just going to delay our release times even more. So the resolution to this is, of course, to implement some form of automation. But like with all digital transformation, automation being no exception, the journey here is one that involves proper thought, planning, and execution. It's not something you just jump into right away, which James will get into a little bit later. So the question or the goal, is it just to simply do more testing, or is there more to it? Well, great question, you might ask. So you may have heard the saying, work smarter, not harder. So this is another version of that, test smarter, not harder. And I've put a quote to go along with this. I really love this quote. I've used it before, but I can't get away from it because I think it's just so true in terms of how we want to test often and test better. So the quote reads, as ironic as it might seem, the challenge of a tester is to test as little as possible. Test less, but test smarter. So it's not always about just testing more often, but it's also testing more efficiently and testing your applications at scale and getting more coverage across all of your business scenarios. So testing smarter means being more intentional about your testing processes and planning for scale, of course. But a common myth that we often hear is if you're a manual testing team, that automation, it's just not a good fit for our team. We don't necessarily have the resources to adopt automation. And so I would argue that if you have the resources to devote to manual testing, then you can probably redirect some of those resources to looking into some alternative methods for improvement to adopt some forms of automation, similar to how you would adopt DevOps tooling and things like that. So automation obviously was made with scalability and maintainability in mind, and Provar is no exception. So I want to give a brief roadmap before I hand it over to James on how you might begin evaluating or looking into automation within your company. So there's a number of factors to consider here. The first one is, of course, to just analyze your current team's skill sets and be thinking about what the background of your team is and identify some focus areas, some quick wins, some high priority scenarios that you would want to automate where you could get some real improvement in terms of testing hours. The second one is to really be thinking about what level of testing that you're performing and at what frequency. So you need to figure out how many hours you're currently devoting to testing and what's your goal with that. Do you want to reduce the number of hours that you spend testing? Do you want to increase your test coverage? These are things to be thinking about as you're looking into automation. Gives you a good baseline for improvement and also to give you a good baseline for ROI over time to know if your investment is paying off. And the last one here, the rabbit hole. So the complexity of testing. So we often refer to here at Provar the complexity barrier. And what this means is there's so many different things in the Salesforce ecosystem that you may be wanting to test. There's Salesforce, there's all your different end systems, there's APIs, there's databases, there's external systems that are talking to and from Salesforce. You want to be able to test all of that together in an end-to-end scenario, not just in isolation. Because what we often find as we get into the later stages of development, that if you haven't tested everything as it works from beginning to end, you may see things behaving slightly differently. So that's the whole purpose of end-to-end automation. This really helps you establish, where you're going to go in the future. So enterprises need to be thinking about how they can break through this complexity barrier that we are talking about here. And the last point is transparency. So really in regards to analytics and reporting, so you need to be thinking about the results of your test cases, where those are going to live, and how you're going to track on that over time to give you a good metric on how you're doing, how you're performing in terms of your test automation, and where your company can improve. So above all things, really it's important to identify and align with a solution that scales with you and your needs as a business to avoid the cost of switching later on. So not just to be thinking about what would work right now with the current team and the resources that we have today, but also be thinking about the future, 2 years down the line, where do you want to be and will that solution continue to serve your business in the way that it needs to? So with that being said, I'll hand it over to Mr. James to talk through some of the case study.
Thank you. At the Queensland University of Technology, we've been using Provar for a few years now, and we've been using it in parallel to embarking on a large-scale Salesforce implementation that is ensuring that our learners and partners and staff are better placed to be at the centre of everything that we do. To set the scene of Salesforce at QUT, we're using all components of it, and we're using it within one org across 24 separate and distinctly different business groups. We're using over 2 million pieces of data to create that single view of person and their engagement with us. We're bringing that enterprise data into our org and overlaying that with sales and service to support how we engage with our students, how we outreach with our students, how they inquire with us and get that support from us in those moments that matter. And we're using Marketing Cloud to personalise the communications that we're sending in ways that matter, in channels that are relevant, at times that are essential. We're using experience and commerce as a means to supporting our professional and executive education, such that learners, no matter where they are in their educational journey, can discover, register, and ultimately access the professional offerings that have been co-designed with our university colleagues. Between 22 and as we come to the end of 24, as I say, there are about 24 separate business groups that will be using one org to provide support, to use our platform in their service ecosystem. Across that, 750 frontline agents, advisors will be providing support in different contexts, pre, during and post-study. We'll be building on the 2 million pieces of data that we already have, and in the process we've been killing off things. 25 local systems and databases, many a spreadsheet, many an Access database. It's been a bit of fun. But as we've been implementing this change at speed, at scale, we've been thinking about that often friction point between speed and quality. We knew that we needed to operate at speed, considering the perspectives of the business who are looking to us to ensure that we're delivering value to them in effective ways, in ways that give them that value as quickly as possible. But we also knew that we had to consider the quality and the expectations that our IT service has on us when it comes to protecting the institution from severity defects, ensuring that we've got no production instances, particularly as we continue to build on what we have in an iterative fashion and roll that capability out across QUT in a very fast-paced way and often in parallel with one another. So we needed to think about, well, how do we combat that? How do we ensure that our testing approach is robust enough to balance those two perspectives? So we can only combat risk with testing. We can only assure our quality with testing, but not just testing in the traditional sense. We knew that our testing had to be complemented with automation testing that allowed us to assure that large single org instance of Salesforce, but in ways that ensures that our testing stays in step with us, particularly as we continue our development progress. When we were thinking about our implementation, we knew that automation testing was part of that, but we knew we needed to have a roadmap in that process. We knew that the journey to support automation tested started with the operating model. We knew that we had to establish the teams, the tools, the governance, the ways of working to ensure our enablement. We knew that we had to develop and mature our DevOps approach such that the ability to deploy, test and release at scale was there, that we had the ability to automatically create Salesforce environments with test users and synthetic data with ease. We knew that we first had to perfect those manual test cases to ensure that we had an established base. We ensured that our test cases followed an end-to-end scenario, those critical paths that are necessary to support the business in their usage of the features and workflows. We knew that we had to have those test cases written and executed as part of our overall release cycle and infuse testing with our DevOps approach. From that, having that base, we were able to create those automated test cases. We were able to ensure that we could use those manual test cases in a way that was useful, was meaningful, could be automated with ease, and that we could apply those within our sandboxes. Then we tested our test cases. We needed to make sure that they were actually going to work for us. We needed to run them through the cycle a couple of times. We needed to make sure that it worked at least in one of our many sandboxes before we deployed it into the full sandbox with our DevOps models. And then once we had all of those levels of assurance and that confidence that all these things together would ensure that our testing was robust enough, we then embedded our testing automation into our regression suite. And we ensured that that was part of our overall release cycles. In any digital program, you've got to think about testing in context of the team. And that we needed to ensure that we had these key roles collaborating in amongst our program ecosystem. For your testing to be successful, some key roles you need to think about as part of your ways of working, as part of your operating model, is of course the test manager, empowering them to ensure that they are responsible for developing that test plan that considers automation as well as manual testing, in concert to the end-to-end flow of work that you're introducing. You need to introduce a lead automation tester who sets the technical foundations, establishes those best practices, identifies those common ways of working, those patterns that can be reused time and time again. You need to complement that team with automated testers, not just functional or manual testers, who are responsible for developing those automated test cases and seeing them through, refining and tweaking as you go. And then you need to empower your technical leads and DevOps engineers such that the test environment is fully prepared and ready for the seamless execution of testing at moments through that DevOps process. These roles are not only integrated within their respective squads within our ops model, but across the entire value streams that we have at QUT. The testers form clans of like roles that are centres of expertise to share knowledge and standardise those ways of working and reduce single points of failure where possible. And doing so allows that one squad of specialists can work together consistently to deliver a function that enables one value stream to implement the development as one to then ultimately realise one program of work. The way I like to frame it, one clan, one squad, one stream, one dream. On to our ways of working, it's important to ensure that your test environment is fully prepared for seamless execution in the creation of your test users, here referred as personas. As you're building out your test suite, make sure that your Jira stories are framed in context of those personas. Ensure that your developers are designing and building features tailored to one or more of those personas. Ensure that your manual testers are executing these test cases by simulating the actions of these personas, and ensure that you're managing and running these test scripts in concert with the personas to ensure that the functionality is thoroughly validated. The Salesforce user needs to be at the centre of both development and your testing efforts as you execute. But configuring a user in Salesforce is somewhat complex. Here's a nice visual of that complexity. While many of us in the room are familiar with creating users in Salesforce, let's take a quick look at some of the key steps involved. You've got to set those basic user informations. Make sure that you've got the user's name and the email all set up. You need to make sure that you're assigning the profile and the roles and the licenses accordingly. Select what's appropriate, such as a marketing user or a knowledge user, before saving the record. You need to identify additional assignments. So assign those perm groups, those perm set license agreements, user groups and queues. And then the combination of these configurations define your unique persona from which you can test. As you can imagine, the scale brings complexity. Creating and maintaining test users or personas becomes increasingly challenging as the system grows, especially when the design involves. For our single Salesforce org, we manage over 60 sandboxes, more than 106 unique personas across those 24 different business groups. Our test team does very much enjoy all of doing that. So can you picture this? Manually creating each of those personas. Beyond that, it's even more daunting when you've got to imagine every of those personas in each of those sandboxes that need to be updated each time. And then, tackling the challenge of efficiencies in DevOps. That's important. You've got to think about all of those things, and that's where automation testing can come into play. But you can't just jump into automation testing. It's part of something. It's part of a toolkit that comes online when you have a stable and fully tested environment. You need to make sure you do execute those manual test cases to ensure that the existing production features are working as designed. You need to make sure that you're testing those critical paths as agreed to with the business and in consideration to their ways of working and their flow of work. You need to make sure that it's persona-based testing. Don't test it as a system admin to make sure that it's valid. And make sure you do user acceptance testing with your business stakeholders. Once you've got that strong baseline, then you can convert those manual test cases into automation test cases and then apply that within your regression suite. You ensure that it's added into your subsequent cycles of release and development. Make sure that you repeat this process time and time again, and through that you'll refine your practice, refine the quality of your testing, and ensure that it scales as you continue to release and go on. So to summarise the QUT ambition as my voice starts to leave, we wanted the ability to run an automated test case. We wanted to ensure that we could apply it in all of our environments. We wanted to make sure that it was persona specific, and we wanted to make sure that we could do so with speed, with the assurance of quality, and that we could scale it up to multiple teams. And with that, I'll hand back to Mike.
Thank you for that, James. Yeah, so quite the scale there when you're looking at all those personas and looking at the different business units and the sheer number of dev sandboxes that we're working with here. So we're thinking about executing these tests. This is kind of the last bit of our conversation today. Obviously, in terms of automation, it's running somewhere. It's not running on a developer's workstation or a tester's machine, right? So that's where we talk about automation agents, and I don't mean Agentforce. I should preface that. I'm not talking about that here. So we've seen kind of how automation can carry heavy returns. I showed you some stats in the beginning, but really part of that scaling process involves scaling your architecture as well to grow with your testing ambitions over time. So initially, you're not going to need 100 different machines running different automation agents, because you're not going to have 100 automated test cases, right? So it's something to think about as you continue to scale, but you need to think about this ahead of time so you can get to that point when you're ready. And this graph here kind of shows how QUT has migrated over the past few months here from the sheer number of tests that they've had to execute through an automated process. So beginning in June, we looked at about 40 test cases that were being executed across 2 different agents, these automation agents. And that roughly took about 8 hours of execution time to get through all those test cases. And we can see with some optimization and with some parallelization here how we were to better achieve some scalability with that automation. So scaling up to about 115 tests across 6 different agents with only a 6-hour execution time. And then further along, coming to the current month, 156 tests were being executed over the course of 7 hours with 6 agents being utilized in that case. So with some optimization, some parallelization, those are obviously best practices when it gets to the scalability of automated testing. But it's one thing to kind of look at it here and say, oh, this looks great, but how do we actually accomplish this? So some best practices to go along with automated testing at scale and parallelizing your automated testing is to be thinking about each test executing in isolation, but also each test is going to be executing in such a way that it can be ran alongside other automated tests without them stepping on each other's toes, because you don't want to have that interference between 2 different personas running at the same time. So these are just things to think about as you're beginning your automated processes and your automated testing journey. So now that we've discussed how QUT has accomplished this automated testing at scale and at speed, we'll discuss how you might get started. So you may be looking at all this and it may seem a little daunting. You may be wondering, where do we begin with all this? It seems rather complex. It seems like it could be quite an endeavor. But fear not, I'm here to kind of guide you through and give you the groundwork on how you might begin this process. So not to be cliche, but it all does start with people. Your team needs to be ready and planning ahead for what's coming. They need to be talking about how they might scale your testing beyond what you're doing currently today. And this is going to depend on your current tool stack. It's going to depend on what your team's comfortable with. Do you have a team of QAs? Is it mostly admins or developers? Be thinking about what they may be able to learn and wanting to kind of get into and do more of. You also should utilize learning platforms and education that's readily available to you and documentation that you currently have at your disposal. Speaking on Provar's behalf here, we do have our free online learning. We can go to provar.me, and that's our free education platform where you can learn more about testing, software quality, DevOps, mostly in the Salesforce testing space there. So you can get certified on a couple of different things there, and it's all free. So I would encourage you to register and go on there. The next part of this is processes, which are just as vital as the people who perform them. You need to be accounting for all of your different environments that you're going to be testing, the different use cases that you might have, thinking about what are the highest priority, the highest risk test cases in our different environments that we're wanting to test. And as James was detailing, the different personas that you're wanting to test as, and the different permutations of data, right? You want to test for all variations of data sets, not just a single happy path. So ensure that your testing processes take this into account, and you're not just accomplishing one, but thinking about the scale. And the last part of this is the technology that makes it all possible. So find tools that work for you and your use cases, not the other way around, right? Don't try to find something and tailor fit it to what you're doing, but think about what you're good at, like I was saying with the people aspect, what your team is comfortable with, and then find a tool that complements that. Also, plan your architecture for scale. I would encourage you when you're thinking about this. Obviously, you may not start out with 10,000 test cases and 200 different personas that you're wanting to test, but you may be there one day, right? Dream big. So with that being said, I'll conclude today. We will have a brief Q&A if there are any questions. For those of you that want to catch a summary of this, I should say that this summary will be available on Einstein, available soon. We'll have to get that posted on there. But for those of you that want to continue the conversation as well, you can find us in the Trailblazer Forest at booth number 1, which is in the back left corner, and then also in the main campground there at booth 1013. So that being said, thank you all so much. Hope you enjoyed today's session.